So, Stephen, can I ask you first how the idea came about to have an International Migration Institute at the university?
Well, when I came to Oxford in 2001 to be director of the Refugee Studies Centre, Oxford had refugee studies but no other forms of migration research, except of course some people in colleges were or in departments were doing migration research, but there was no centre. And the Refugee Studies Centre was something that had been there for 20 years or more and was doing really important work. Steve Vertevec had started the Transnational Communities Programme some years before, and the British Economic and Social Research Council decided in 2001 that Britain really needed a high-level academic research centre on migration, because migration was a key issue for this country. So Steve and I got together also with Frank Peake, and we put in an application to have that centre, and that's what became Compass, the Centre on Migration, Policy and Society. So Oxford then had a Refugee Studies Centre which was looking at refugees and asylum, and it had Compass, which was working essentially on migration and policy issues concerning Britain and Europe. But there wasn't anything really focusing on issues of migration and development and how migration affected the developing world. And we thought there was a big gap. And when James Martin decided to start what became the James Martin School of the 21st Century, he was looking to identify the key issues which would affect humanity in the 21st century. We managed to convince him that migration was one of those, with a lot of help from our then Vice-Chancellor, John Hood. And the International Migration Institute became one of the first batch of research institutes within the James Martin School. And yeah, so we thought that that gave a real opportunity, and we needed to decide where to focus, because although we had sort of ideas of looking at migration as a global issue and migration and development in particular, we also felt it was essential to have an empirical focus. So we really wanted to work everywhere, but we didn't have the resources. So we decided first on Africa and on Central Asia as areas of key emphasis. And then in the end, the resources were only sufficient to work in one area. So we decided to focus on Africa.
So what particular vision did you have for the Institute when it began?
Well, when we started, we wanted to have a global approach, but we knew that we had to do empirical work too. And you can't do empirical work everywhere. So we wanted to select some areas. And the initial idea was to focus on Africa and on Central Asia, both areas which are very under-researched. But in the end, the resources were not adequate for both areas. So we decided to focus on Africa. And of course, there's a lot of expertise at Oxford University on Africa and on development in Africa. I think what really shaped the International Migration Institute was the initial decisions about who to hire. And we were really, really fortunate because we managed to find two outstanding young researchers who really had a vision of where they wanted to go. So Oliver Bakewell, who'd done a lot of research on both forced migration and other forms of migration in Africa, was really questioning the division between forced migration and economic migration. And Hein de Haas, who had done his doctorate in southern Morocco, knew a great deal about North Africa and about the Middle East. So we really started with that expertise. And we spent a lot of time in the first few months thinking through what we wanted to do and came out with a sort of manifesto, which is still on the website of the IMI and obviously still stands as a declaration of intention. And the idea was really firstly to see migration not on its own, but as a product of or part of much bigger changes affecting the world today, connected with globalization, neoliberalization, and the importance of mobility of people in those processes. And we also wanted to be critical about the conventional wisdom about migration and development. We were questioning that from the outset. And we also questioned the policy approach that was common, or still is common actually, in most developed countries, which is the idea that migration is a bad thing, and that by addressing the root causes of migration in countries of origin, it can and should be stopped. And we never believed that. We always saw migration as an essential part of human development, and we've always argued that development would lead to more migration and not less, which you can see very clearly if you look at countries like Britain, which actually have a huge migration in and out, because a lot of British people go and work in other countries to gain experience. So, you know, migration is not something that is an aberration and should be stopped. It should be done in legal channels. I mean, we're against irregularity, which we see as the result of policies that don't recognise economic and social needs. And we really want to try and influence the way people think about these things, the way the public thinks, the way academics think, and the way policymakers think.
So at the beginning, when you were shaping this vision, it was there was you and Steven Vertevec and Oliver Bakewell and Hein de Haas.
Yeah.
And then obviously some more funding came on board. And so today there are now 16 people working for the Institute. Did you expect it to grow in that way when it started at the beginning?
Well, we expected it to grow. We knew that we only had funding for a core team and that we had to go out and get funding for specific research contracts. The importance of core funding is that it allows you to be choosy. It allows you to focus on the things you really want to do. I don't think you can run a research centre or institute without core funding. So that core funding that initially came from the Martin School through Jim Martin's bequest, donation to the university, made it possible to have a very innovative and broad approach. We were, I think, very successful in getting other forms of funding for specific projects. And since I've left the Institute in 2009, I think my successors, first Robin Cohen as director, and Hein and Ollie have been enormously successful. And they've also been very successful in their personnel policy, because they've built up a really good team of young researchers, a good administrative core, led by Brian E. Truscott, who played a very big part in the development of the Institute. And it really is working very well. I'm very happy when I come back here and see how it's developed.
So in terms of migration studies as an academic discipline, can you tell me what you think some of the main advances have been since setting up of the Institute in 2006?
Well, I think the main thing is to understand that migration isn't something you can study on its own, that you really have to study the way societies are changing, the way communities are changing, the way migrants and non-migrants indeed develop their agency. So we're moving towards an approach, I think, and this is what I'm doing in Sydney now too, where we see the social transformation of society through all these macro level changes as a crucial context. And we try and understand how that works at different levels. So for instance, at the national level, where you have specific histories, specific conceptions of what mobility is about, and then what happens in local communities and how they're affected either by immigration or by emigration.
Finally, do you have any thoughts about the future direction of IMI?
I think IMI is doing a number of things, and all of them seem very meaningful. I mean, one of them is this Global Migrations Futures project, which is why I'm here in Oxford at the moment, which is really trying to think through possible scenarios for the future. Now, you can't predict the future, and if you think about where we were 30 years ago in migration, no one would have predicted where we are now. So it's very good to just think of possibilities in a very broad and open way, and I think that's very good. Another project the Institute is doing is testing some of the conventional theories on how migration flows develop and mature by doing field work with partners in the Netherlands, Norway and Portugal. And that is really a contribution to theory, but it also very useful for public understanding of migration processes. IMI is still doing a lot on Africa. There's been a series of conferences focused on Africa over the years that are beginning to come through as very good publications. It's a good idea, I think, to keep that focus on Africa because it is an area where migration hasn't been very thoroughly studied. IMI is probably ready to branch out and do a lot more at the global level and perhaps look at the Asia-Pacific region, perhaps at Latin America. The partnerships do exist already with researchers in those regions, but there's room to develop them further. And of course, the other thing that's really good for IMI is the cooperation with the other two centres in Oxford. So there's a very valuable division of labour there. The other thing, of course, is to train new researchers, and that, again, is being done. The development of the Migration Studies Masters will mean, going through from the master's level right through to doctorates and postdocs. And I think, I hope that some very innovative young researchers will come out of the process and will replace the older generation that's about to leave. So I'm very happy with the direction. I think IMI shouldn't get too big. If research centres get too big, they lose their common mission. IMI's always had a core mission that I think everyone has understood and supported. So I wouldn't want it to expand a great deal beyond what it is now. It works very well, I guess.
Okay, thank you very much.